Burkina Faso has just pulled off one of the boldest counterterrorism operations the Sahel has ever seen. In mere minutes, over 1,000 militants tied to Al-Qaeda were surrounded and eliminated by just 3 drones. But what followed wasn't applause. It was outrage. Not from those who lived under the shadow of terror, but from far-off voices who questioned not the threat, but the response. This isn't just a story about warplanes and targets. It's about a country that dared to act when no one else would, and the storm of resistance it faced not on the battlefield, but in the global arena of truth. The sun blazed down on the red soil outside Ouahigouya, where dry wind curled around the sparse baobab trees. A small boy kicked up dust as he ran along a dirt path, chasing after a tire he had turned into a toy. In the distance, the low hum of engines buzzed faintly through the air. Most couldn't hear it yet, but Ibrahim Traoré could. He stood at the edge of a military airfield, his eyes locked on the sky. To those around him, he was more than a president. He was a soldier who had not forgotten the land he came from, nor the promise he made when he rose in the ranks. To protect Burkina Faso from the rot eating away at it, terror, deceit, and the weight of foreign meddling. 2 officers walked up beside him, stiff in their uniforms. "They've crossed the threshold," one said. "Let's begin," Ibrahim replied. Above them, 3 drones glided into formation like hawks on a hunt. 2 bore the scars of faraway engineering. Painted in muted grays, marked only by symbols from the east. The 3rd gleamed newer, its sensors blinking in the harsh light. It had taken months to gather intelligence on the convoy. The enemy was careful. Al-Qaeda fighters moving through rural terrain, hiding in plain sight, sometimes even posing as merchants or aid workers. The attack plan was surgical. Precision was paramount. Ibrahim had insisted on it. This mission was not just about neutralizing threats. It was about sending a message. One of autonomy, capability, and sovereignty. Burkina Faso would no longer rely on others to secure its borders. Not after the broken promises. Not after the years of watching external powers turn their homeland into a chessboard. The convoy had entered the ambush zone. The drones fanned out in a V formation over the scrubland. A decoy vehicle, placed intentionally by local militia, rolled slowly toward the main road. The trap was elegant. As expected, the convoy began to adjust its path, clustering toward the opening. The moment of contact was less than a second long. A pulse of light, the buzz of coordinates confirmed, and 3 missiles lanced downward. The explosion was sharp and sudden. Only 1 truck survived, left untouched intentionally, knowing the remaining gunmen would scramble to in panic. They did. As they retreated, believing escape possible, the final strike landed with surgical precision. In less than an hour, it was done. Over 1,000 fighters had been eliminated. No civilian casualties were confirmed. The town's elders, who had seen their people terrorized for years, wept openly at the news. But the elation was short-lived. 2 days later, an article emerged, an international headline, splashed with tragic certainty. Burkina Faso drone strike kills 100 civilians, it read. The article cited anonymous sources, referred to unnamed witnesses, and bore the mark of a familiar broadcaster with roots far from West Africa. The story spread like wildfire. Western pundits dissected the operation on television panels, questioning ethics, warning of authoritarian overreach, and clutching to a moral high ground. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim read the article in silence. He had been through this before. To him, it was not just a misrepresentation, it was war. A different kind. A war of narratives. A war of who gets to define good and evil. His advisors debated a public response. But Ibrahim already knew what to do. He sent his military attaché to speak with village leaders, to gather first-hand testimony. Independent journalists from within the region were invited to verify. Satellite images and audio logs were declassified and shared through local networks. People from the region spoke on camera, their voices shaking with rage. Do they think we don't know the difference between a fighter and a farmer? Our children couldn't go to school. Now they can. We saw those men with our own eyes. They were not villagers. They were wolves dressed as neighbors. But the world only heard what it wanted to hear. To many, the damage was done. In a modest compound outside Bobo-Dioulasso, a man named Mamadou stood before a fire, speaking quietly with his wife. He had once been an interpreter for a Western NGO, but now ran a cooperative that helped resettle families displaced by conflict. He knew firsthand the cost of misinformation. "They don't want us to win without them," he said, sipping from a gourd of cool water. "They see our allies and they panic. If it were their drones, this would be called a success." His wife nodded. "And when their missiles hit the wrong homes, they call it unfortunate." Nearby, the radio crackled. A local station was replaying Ibrahim's speech from the day before. "Burkina Faso will not be defined by the fears of others," the president had said. "We will not ask permission to protect our children." Mamadou turned to his wife. "It's not about drones. It's about dignity." Meanwhile, in Moscow, Ibrahim arrived to quiet applause from regional leaders. The air was colder, the suits stiffer, but the handshakes were genuine. His attendance was a signal, not a favor. One of his counterparts leaned in during a closed-door meeting. "They're afraid because you are writing your own story now," he said. Ibrahim didn't smile. He just nodded. The war he was fighting wasn't just in the scrublands. It was also in the newsrooms, in the headlines, in the words that shape public perception thousands of miles away. He knew this well, but he also knew one thing with certainty. This was only the beginning. The morning air was cool in Ouagadougou, but inside the government compound, tension simmered. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a map that stretched across an entire wall. Red pins marked areas that had once been strongholds of insurgent activity. Many of them were now gone, cleared through long months of precise work and careful planning. Yet none of it seemed to matter in the eyes of those crafting stories abroad. He turned to Colonel Seydou, a trusted aide and lifelong comrade. "They won't stop," Ibrahim said. "As long as we succeed without them, they'll find a way to twist it." Colonel Seydou looked tired, but resolute. "We've released the recordings, the coordinates, the footage. Still, they ignore it." "They're not ignoring," Ibrahim replied. "They're choosing." Reports were coming in from rural towns. Fear not of terror, but of misrepresentation. People worried that international aid might be cut off because of the media's portrayal. Families dependent on medicine, education grants, and trade subsidies were caught in the crossfire of perception. And in a quiet office in London, a journalist named Emma Hayes clicked through footage she wasn't supposed to have. It had been sent to her by a whistleblower in Ghana, someone who'd grown uneasy watching stories manipulated to fit narratives. The video was clear. It showed the convoy of armed fighters, the moments leading up to the drone strike, and the retreat toward the intact truck. There were no children, no women, no village, just militants, armed and organized. Emma leaned back in her chair. She had covered conflicts in Syria and Libya. She knew the difference between an accident and a strategy. What puzzled her wasn't the footage, it was the complete lack of interest her newsroom showed in it. When she brought the evidence to her editor, the response was swift. "We're not here to clean up after strongmen," he said. "We tell the story the audience needs." "And what story is that?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. He leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "The one that makes sense to our readers." Emma walked out without another word. Back in Burkina Faso, local journalist Issa Tambura sat with Ibrahim in a sparse office lit by morning light. "They're calling it a massacre," Issa said, scrolling through articles on a cracked tablet. Ibrahim nodded. "Because they need us to be savages in their story. If we're not, they lose control of the script." "Will you respond?" "I already did," Ibrahim said. "With results. But the next chapter, this time, it won't be written by them." Issa smiled. "Then let's tell it ourselves." He launched a new media initiative the next day. A national network run by Burkinabe journalists, backed by independent filmmakers and funded not through foreign grants, but local cooperatives and diaspora contributions. The goal, to cover their own country with their own eyes and their own words. The first story aired 2 days later. It showed interviews with survivors of past insurgent attacks, school teachers, mothers, elders, people who had lived through horror and now spoke of relief, of safety, of sleeping through the night for the first time in years. The video went viral across West Africa. Elsewhere, in the region of Fadengorma, an old man named Malik sat outside a small tea house, watching his grandchildren chase goats through the yard. He remembered the days when fighters used to pass through the town like ghosts, never staying long, but always leaving behind fear. Now, for the first time in years, the road was clear. No bribes to pay, no whispers in the market. He sipped his tea and listened to the radio. A program narrated by a griot was playing, a storyteller weaving the story of the drone strike, recounting it not as tragedy, but as victory, a retelling grounded in the oral tradition of the region. Malik closed his eyes and smiled. They were remembering how to speak for themselves again. But the backlash wasn't only in articles. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. A diplomatic envoy from a European nation visited Ibrahim quietly. They were polite, but firm. "You must consider the international perception," the envoy said. "If you want investment, if you want cooperation, these operations must align with humanitarian standards." Ibrahim raised an eyebrow. "We used 3 drones. We saved thousands of civilians from future attacks. We showed restraint. Tell me, how many civilians were killed in your last drone strike across the Mediterranean?" The envoy didn't answer. "You talk of investment," Ibrahim continued. "But where was your investment when we asked for radar systems? When we asked for infrastructure instead of lectures?" He stood up, slowly, deliberately. "If your cooperation depends on our silence, we'll find partners who prefer our voice." The meeting ended in cool formality. Meanwhile, at a university in Tankadogo, students packed into an auditorium to watch a documentary screening. It was made by a group of young filmmakers who had followed the military operation closely, using drones not for combat, but for storytelling. The footage included interviews, archival materials, and personal reflections from soldiers on the ground. The crowd stood and clapped when the credits rolled. The last frame read, "We tell our own story now." And far from Burkina Faso, in a boardroom in Washington, a group of analysts studied the situation with growing concern. "He's changing the game," one said. "They're not just fighting insurgents," another added. "They're fighting the narrative. Then we need a new strategy." But they were already too late. Because in markets and schools, in fields and village squares, people were talking differently. They no longer feared silence. They feared misinterpretation. And with every video, every broadcast, every testimony shared across networks built not by money, but by trust, the story was shifting. This was no longer just about drones. It was about dignity reclaimed. Nightfall came quietly to the Sahel. The skies, once chaotic with uncertainty, now felt still, even sacred. Yet beneath that stillness, a storm brewed, not of bullets or bombs, but of resistance and retaliation. Ibrahim Traoré sat at a small table on the veranda of his presidential residence. The house wasn't grand. Its whitewashed walls and rusted gutters were reminders that the country's resources had long served others before its own. A single lamp buzzed beside him as he read a letter from a group of mothers in Djibo. Their sons had been kidnapped months before and were presumed dead. Now, with the collapse of one of the last insurgent corridors, the women had found closure. Grief finally had a face. The letter ended simply, "You fought for us when no one else did. We will remember." He folded the paper and set it beside a glass of tamarind juice. Across from him, Colonel Seydu sat watching him. "They're building a coalition," the colonel said after a long silence. "Who?" Ibrahim asked, though he already knew. "The ones who called us savages. Now they say they want peace, stability, oversight. They mean control." Seydu nodded. "They've arranged a panel. Delegates from across the ocean. They're asking us to submit a report, to explain the legality of the strike, to prove our innocence." Ibrahim chaklit diriyeliye. "I didn't know innocence required permission." He stood and looked out at the horizon, dark and vast. "They think we can be swayed with conferences," he said. But they don't see that he gestured out into the night. This is our battlefield now. The land, the air, the stories. We will not abandon any of it. In a cluttered office in the capital, Issa Tambura clicked away at a keyboard. His articles had drawn the attention of both local readers and distant skeptics. One of his most recent pieces, titled From the Ground, The View They Refused to Show, had been translated into 5 languages and republished by grassroots organizations worldwide. But now his sources were facing pressure. A village teacher who had testified to witnessing the drone operation had gone missing. A cameraman in Kaya had been attacked. Issa himself had received anonymous threats. Still, he pressed on. They're afraid, he told his colleague, a young woman named Miriam, not of what we did, but of what we're proving, that African blood can defend itself with intelligence, not savagery. Miriam paused, staring at her screen. They just sanctioned us, she said quietly. Who did? A European trading bloc. Arms embargo. Technology freeze. Issa leaned back. He expected it, but it stung nonetheless. Drones, satellites, infrastructure, all tied to deals made years ago under different leaders. Agreements dressed as partnerships but built on dependency. Now those strings were being pulled again. Word of the sanctions spread quickly. In marketplaces, whispers passed from vendor to customer. In schools, children overheard their teachers discussing supply shortages. In rural clinics, solar-powered refrigerators flickered as spare parts grew scarce. But something unexpected followed: resilience. In a mining town of Hound, engineers began building rudimentary drone components from scrap metal. In Kédougou, coders taught themselves new software, replacing Western tools with homegrown alternatives. In the capital, a group of students launched a campaign called Nyanga, which means pride, in one of the local languages. Posters appeared across the country. If they won't give us tools, we'll forge our own. If they won't hear our story, we'll shout it from the mountains. What was meant to break morale had sparked a movement. Meanwhile, Ibrahim made a bold move. He invited leaders from neighboring nations, many of whom faced similar internal struggles, to his summit in Bobo Dioulasso. The agenda was simple: security without interference, partnerships without compromise, and media independence. The turnout was larger than expected. Leaders from across West and Central Africa arrived, some quietly, some openly. Not all supported Ibrahim's tactics, but they all shared a common frustration: the persistent condescension from distant powers. In his opening speech, Ibrahim addressed them plainly. They say we are dangerous when we defend ourselves. They call us reckless when we refuse to bow. But the real danger, he said, is believing we must always ask permission to survive. Applause thundered in the old colonial hall, where French once ruled and now stood forgotten. A declaration was drafted, signed by every attending nation. It would not hold the power of treaties, but it would be heard. It was called the right to self-guard. Across the Atlantic, the backlash continued. Editorials claimed the region was sliding into authoritarianism. Think tanks painted Ibrahim as another despot in uniform. Western governments issued veiled warnings about foreign influence, Russia, China, and the like, implying that alliances with such nations were not only unwise but dangerous. But for people like Mamadou, the former interpreter turned cooperative leader, the message from abroad was losing its power. At a town meeting under a canopy of mango trees, he stood before dozens of villagers. We cannot survive in someone else's narrative. We must own our truth, even if it's inconvenient to them. A woman in the crowd raised her hand. But what if they punish us for it? Mamadou paused. So she posted herself. It spread like wildfire. Emma's work included interviews, satellite data, voice analysis, and most powerfully, testimonies from people on the ground. The BBC, under pressure, released a quiet correction weeks later, buried in the middle of a longer article, unpromoted. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done, and now it was being undone, not by officials or spokespersons, but by those whose stories had been stolen. In the village of Dori, something even more profound happened. An international delegation, uninvited but persistent, arrived hoping to negotiate terms for renewed cooperation. They came with briefcases, with talking points, and with a language full of caution. They were received by elders, not ministers, not soldiers, not bureaucrats. An old man named Yakuba, nearly blind and bent by time, stood in front of the group. "We are not angry," he said, "but we are not naive. You see us when there is profit, and you forget us when there is pain." The delegates remained silent. Yakuba continued, "If you want to work with us, listen to us. If you want to support us, let us lead." The meeting ended without statements or signatures, just understanding. Meanwhile, a shift began on another front. Regional powers who had once distanced themselves from Ibrahim's government began quietly opening dialogue, not just about counterterrorism, but about technology, education, and trade, on terms that reflected mutual respect. The reliance on former colonial currencies began to wane. Agricultural cooperatives started trading directly with neighboring nations using mobile credit systems. Engineers from Burkina Faso were now training others in Mali and Niger on the homemade drone systems they developed during the sanctions. What had started as survival had evolved into sovereignty. But Ibrahim knew better than to declare victory. One evening, he met with Colonel Seydou and Issa Tambura in the old war room, though no plans for battle were on the table. They sat over maps of media networks, data reports, new curriculum outlines. "Are we winning?" Issa asked softly. Ibrahim looked at him, then glanced at the window where the sky was dark but clear. "We're remembering who we are," he said. "That's more than winning." Colonel Seydou poured them all tea. "I used to think freedom meant no chains," he said. "Now I think it means speaking even when the world demands silence." They drank in silence. At the University of Kédougou, a new course was introduced, media literacy and sovereignty. It was taught in 4 languages, including local dialects. It covered not just journalism, but history, geopolitics, and oral tradition. One of the first lessons was titled, "How to Hear Yourself in a Room Full of Noise." Students wrote essays not on what happened, but how it was remembered. One student wrote, "History doesn't belong to the loudest. It belongs to the last word." Months passed. The country was not perfect. There were still attacks, still challenges, still poverty. But there was a new rhythm, a new voice in the wind. And in the markets, when someone told a story, they didn't ask whether it was safe to say. They asked whether it was true. In Bobo de Lasso, where the summit had taken place, a monument was being constructed, not to the drones, not to the soldiers, but to the storytellers. It was shaped like a calabash bowl turned upside down, symbolizing the world flipped, rebalanced. Around it were carved the names of journalists, elders, poets, and ordinary people who had spoken up. At its center, a plaque read, "They thought our silence was surrender, but it was breath, preparing the voice of a people." And somewhere high above, in the quiet skies of Ouahigouya, a drone flew. Unarmed, just watching, just listening, like the people below it had learned to do.